Hello everyone and welcome to our final series, our EDI TV series called Professional Development, Proud to Be. Today's episode is very important like all the rest of them. Today is about Black history. Why is it important and how do we use this in our sector to further develop and support our learners and staff? Today we've got some very special guests joining us and I also have our co-host Piers Alexander. Thank you everyone for joining us. Piers, so Black history is a really important topic that we need to be talking about.
Absolutely. It's a very, very important part of the curriculum. And I think it's very important for us to as teachers, to understand our place and our responsibilities for young people within the larger context of Black history, in how we deliver, how we approach topics in the classroom. And it's which is what we're doing today. It's vitally important to speak to people outside of the organisation. And get a wider perspective. Exactly.
And we're the first college, as people know, in the country to be facilitating Black history in FE. But there's so many amazing people and people joining us today that are doing the work, doing the groundwork and supporting, all different areas of EDI, but specifically Black history as well.
Absolutely.
So on that measure, I think it's really important to introduce our fabulous guests we have joining us.
Absolutely. Okay. Liz, hi, welcome to the show. Could you please introduce yourself a little?
Yeah, absolutely. And hello to both of you. Thank you for having me. My name's Liz Pemberton, and I have got an anti-racist training and consultancy company called the Black Nursery Manager. So it will be no surprise that the hint in the title is that I work in the early years sector, and all of the work that I do really is about focusing and centralising our thoughts around what it's like for racially minoritized children under 5 to experience early years education in the UK. So the work that I've done really has led me to be in lots of different spaces, including local authorities, early years providers, settings, nurseries in the private, voluntary and independent sector. And prior to that, I spent 16 years as a children's day nursery manager, working in Birmingham, where I'm from, and also thinking about what it meant to be working with communities of children and families that I also was a part of, primarily Black and brown children and families. And so the work that I've kind of thought about doing and now I'm really kind of invested in is thinking about that pedagogy around anti-racism in the early years and what it means in a practical sense, thinking about drawing on all of our histories and how they're intertwined. And also the notion, I guess, that you were saying, Black history, what that means in this context in 2022 for children who were perhaps born in the pandemic are now 2 years old or 3 years old, and really integrating this notion of Black history being everybody's history. It's all of our history. It's a shared history. And thinking about that in a collaborative way. So that's me.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Liz. Thank you. Alicia, did you want to introduce?
Yeah, and we've also got another amazing special guest, and I think it's really important that the work we do is surrounded by communities and get that support. So without further ado, I'll let you introduce yourself, Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Greenwich. I'm the Director for Diversity at the Association of Colleges, and been working with colleagues across the further education sector, really to highlight the good practice that's taking place out there. What that Liz is doing is brilliant, because what we've got here is an example of the beginning. We start youngsters, we start people young at a young age, and the challenge really is to continue with that curriculum, continue with those stories, so that when we get to 16, 18, 19, young people have an understanding, as Liz said, of their history, their personal history, but also of their shared history. Now, the story that I recount is when I was in school, which was quite a while ago. There's a TV program called Roots. And from my perspective, it seemed that all Black people were slaves. And, for a sort of a 14-year-old, that hit hard. That was really quite disconcerting. Thankfully, in the school I went to, I actually did Latin as a subject. And what that Latin teaching taught me, and that my teachers taught me, was that Black people were here a long time ago. They were here during the time of the Romans. And you know what? A lot of those Black people were generals and in fact emperors. So a Black person wasn't defined by slavery. The Black person could be defined by being a general or by being an emperor. So from a very early age, I had that support, and that's helped me throughout my career, not to come from a place of deficit, but to come from a place of power in a sense. So I think it's really important that we start young, as Liz is doing with her nursery, and then build that up through the sector. And FE, I think, is key in continuing that story, continuing that journey.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And like you're both saying, Jeff and Liz, representation matters. And I remember, from my own personal sort of lived experience, the first time I was taught Black history in school, I thought, brilliant, I'm going to find out about my father's side of the family, learning it from an educational spectrum. And it was watching Roots, and I can kind of felt myself in the chair getting smaller and smaller as, this series was going on, because I was thinking, oh my goodness, so is that all we were? We just did slavery and then it was civil rights, and that's all Black people have contributed, into society. And I think it's really important when we think about representation does matters, and there's so many more, I call them the untold stories of our community, to be told, because it's important for everybody to understand the narratives of it all. So yeah, really important. So my question goes back to Liz, because I think it's really important. How important do you think it is for children under the age of 5 to understand about these narratives and talking about Black history?
I think when you're looking at kind of some of the guidance around how we should engage with children under 5, there's always a focus on the unique child. Okay, so when we look at the unique child, what does that mean in the context of one's cultural identity, in terms of one's racial identity, and thinking about location, so geography, where has that child been born, where have they been brought up, what is the rich tapestry that has led them to being there, and also understanding that there is a journey, and how do we explain that journey to a child as they're kind of developing their sense of self. And I think the conversation that has to be had is about heightening that awareness and making sure that awareness is heightened in a nuanced way. So I know, Alicia, you talked about representation mattering, but it only matters if you're coming from a shared understanding of what it is that you want to achieve. Representation politics has taken on this new lease of life where, a right-wing agenda has attached itself to representation, and then it will tell you we've got the most diverse cabinet. So because we've got representation, we've ticked that box. It doesn't work like that. And so when we're thinking about histories, what we have to also understand is that we have a shared understanding as to how we are telling that history, how we are telling that story. So if we're relating that to children under 5, we're looking at narratives. We're thinking about what space do we give for children to tell their stories, to talk about who they are, to talk about all of those things that happen in their lives, that rich growth that happens between the ages of 0 to 3, 0 to 5. Is there space being given for those narratives to be shared in the early years space? So when I'm delivering training or I'm consulting in the early years sector, I'm asking this question about the narrative. Whose narrative is dominant? If we're accepting we live in a white supremacist society, we're accepting we live in a racist society, we have to then be aware of how whiteness plays its part in shaping narratives. So therefore, those children who are racially minoritized, we have to make sure that they are given that opportunity to share their stories, to talk about who they are, to talk about what makes up their identity in all facets of that. And if we are going to do that, it means we have to also equip the workforce. The practitioners, the teachers that work with these children also have to be aware there's massive value in that. It cannot be a dominant narrative that sets the agenda and that all children must just then assimilate into that. That's where the danger starts.
It's having that sense of belonging as well, isn't it? I think it's really important for a child from a young age to have that sense of belonging, feel proud of their for all different types of backgrounds, and feel like they're a part of everything, and getting that praise, celebration moments as well. And I think that's really important. I remember just thinking about it now, and we're quite lucky, perhaps in some areas, that we do this. That my son came back from school and he drew a picture of a Jamaican flag, and they're able to talk about those sort of aspects. And he brought home other flags from other cultures and backgrounds to talk about, they do this here, mummy, we've got to try this type of food. And it's that sense of identity, belonging, and making people feel a part of, everyone's part of society, but having that and having the narratives, the stories, like you said. So
Absolutely.
It is so important.
Liz, could I ask a question, please? Could you just please tell us a little bit about some of the positives, but also some of the challenges of, as you mentioned, working. It's not just working with the children; it's working with the workforce. as well. So would you be able to tell us a little, sort of some positives, but also some challenges, perhaps?
I mean, I'm not going to tell you positives for the sake of positives. What I'm going to tell you
No,
is
of
my
course.
truth. What I'm going to say to you is that children need to have a sense of agency, but they can only have a sense of agency if they have a sense of empowerment and a feeling of, like, as Alicia said, the sense of belonging. Some of the challenges that I've come up against is really early years sector workers not realizing that we are not existing in a vacuum. Okay, the early years space is a part of wider society, represents wider society, and so the narratives that the society has told itself about who they are with regards to race, culture, ethnicity are those same narratives that creep into the early years space. For instance, it's why we have this flat pack idea around how we celebrate Eid, Diwali, quote unquote Chinese New Year, which should be referred to as Lunar New Year because it isn't just celebrated in China. It's about understanding that when we're talking about Black history, it's all of our history. That without the contributions of Black people globally, particularly in the UK as well, we wouldn't have what we are existing in now, the infrastructure that we are all benefiting from. And so when you're talking about, wanting to present two sides, positives and negatives, the reality is that there is always going to be pushback when you're having conversations pertaining to anti-racism. There's always going to be conversations that are challenging because it's about not positioning white people as being the people that should be made to feel comfortable. And when you're getting into the space of actually challenging and pushing back notions of comfort for people who are racialized as white, who dominate the early years sector, when we look disproportionately, the workforce is made up of white people who are gendered as women. And so there's a narrative there to be explored around what it means to be a woman who's racialized as white, dominating in a sector, in a space where you are responsible for raising, caring for, educating a very diverse, hugely diverse, cohort of children and families, what that means. So we've got to look at positionality as well. And the challenges that are existing within the early years sector with regards to anti-racist practice are the same challenges that we see in wider society. Because we do not exist in a vacuum. We do not exist as separate from what's happening in wider society. So everything you see that's happening in terms of politics, in terms of right-wing agendas, in terms of how anti-racism is being attacked, how we see global narratives coming through and influencing what we do here. If we perhaps think about what happened in the summer of 2020, all of those things impact directly what is going on in the early years sector because it's also linked to government policies. Things that are happening in the early years are directly influenced by what happens in the Department for Education. Who sets the agenda for the Department for Education? So we have to start looking at this structurally, systemically. Everything feeds into one another. I don't know if necessarily I can give you this like positive picture, a negative picture. Everything exists and it's intertwined.
My thing is, I always say this, is sometimes we have to wait for the government and people to catch up for what we're doing, because my approach and our approach to this is that the students should come first in our agenda, and how we support them is really important, and for them to have an understanding of, you know, Britain and how we support and make and everybody have a sense of belonging is very important. One of my questions I think is really important, and I always get asked it, so it's really nice to get your sort of tips as well, Liz, before we move on to Jess, is what are your golden tips you can give anybody in the industry working with learners, work with young people that would like, you know, what can we do? What sort of changes can they start making to support their young people and children?
First of all, you need to start doing work on self. So reflecting on your own positionality. Who are you? Before you come into this sector, before you come into this work, before you come into a position of influence and education, who are you? Have you spent any time doing that deep work around that personal identity work, that social identity work, self-development? Who are you? Positionality is very important when we're thinking about talking about Black history. We can have a conversation about the importance of introducing that in education in the early years, but there's no point doing that if there's not been any work on self. I always reflect on the fact that this conversation is had and we don't often think about who is delivering. I personally don't want somebody who's not got an interest in the importance of Black history to talk to me or any children about Black history. So that work on self is absolutely important, and that requires you to interrogate your own values. What are your own beliefs? What are your own personal understandings around how you have come to be where you are? So that's the very first thing that I would say needs to be done. After that self-development work, thinking about how you navigate the space in the world that you occupy. And that requires you to be really honest about how you perceive yourself, but also how does the world perceive you? How do people interact with you? How do people engage with you? Have you reflected on that? Because often we can have an opinion about how we think the world views us, and then the reality of what's actually happening in how the world receives us. So we have to have a heightened awareness around that as well. And then when we come to this work and we start thinking about the influence that we have on children, know that that influence is going to be different depending on where the children and families are coming from in their own life journeys, knowing that you're not going to have the same impact for every child, and accepting that that's part of the journey, understanding you're going to need to be corrected on things. Learning is about making mistakes. If you are not prepared to make mistakes and to be corrected and to be challenged by somebody who is minoritized for whatever reason, when we talk about and think about, Jeff talks about power and understanding our positionality as people who are from the Black diaspora, knowing that we're not starting from a deficit model, but often the world will see us as starting from a deficit model. So we are the hard to reach people. We are the people that are argumentative. We are the families that are disaffected. We are the inner city people, knowing and understanding that these are labels that are put onto us that do not necessarily speak to our lived experiences, because we're not a homogenous group. So understanding that we are individuals, we're coming here with lots of different ways and means and narratives, and understanding if you're coming to work in a sector where you're educating children, young people, understanding that they need to also have that privilege of individual story, individual narrative, taking that time to listen. We are not a homogenous group. One person does not speak for all of us because we share a racialized identity.
Yeah, and that's so important. And I always say to people, inclusive language and how we speak to people and the terms and words we use is really important. And sometimes you're going to have to get uncomfortable to get comfortable. And it's so important of those elements and reflecting on the words we use, things that people said 50 years ago is completely different than what we'd say now. So it's always about checking yourself, how we say things, and put your hands up sometimes and saying, sorry, I've got it wrong, but I'm willing to learn. And that's what it's about, being an open book and reflecting. So one of the questions I want to ask, your work has been so predominant, Liz, and it's been fantastic. So one of the things is, you've done some amazing national work, especially working with Channel 4 recently, sharing the good practices you're doing, how we start to explore identity and what we need to be doing, working on. So can you just tell me some of the bits you've worked upon, and how that sort of influenced people nationally, and the staff members you've influenced, the young people that are sort of, because your work is really going to sort of shape and help people along the way, which is amazing.
It's been an interesting journey, actually, Alicia. I think when I started this and I set the business and decided to close down my nursery in 2020 and started the work around the Black Nursery Manager in July. So I closed the nursery in March, started the work in July of 2020. I've gone on to work with, as I said, local authorities up and down the country. Most significantly, I think, has been really nice to work with Early Years Wales, which has been really kind of significant in terms of the work that they are willing to do as a collective. It's a very collaborative whole, I'm not going to say whole school approach, but whole country approach on a strategic level, on an individual level, working with a range of people. I myself am not Welsh, but they recognise there's a level of expertise that I have around some of the work and conversations that I've been having. So Early Years Wales has been really kind of significant. I'm starting to do some work at the moment with the International School of Geneva, which has been great, thinking about when we're looking at this through a different lens of people coming from different countries, having different experiences with regards to culture, ethnicity, but some of those themes and topics still remaining the same around the dominance of whiteness and what whiteness means in an international school. Thinking about those experiences that white teachers come in with and the expectations that they have, and dismantling some of the myths that may exist. So that work has been really interesting for me as well. And of course, writing things. So at the moment, I am writing a 4-part series for Nursery World magazine, which is a big sector publication around anti-racist leadership. So I'm doing a 4-part series for them, which has been great because it gets the word out there Some people don't like to listen. Some people prefer to read. That's fine. I'm writing for you as well. And if you're not getting it in that way by attending webinars that I've developed and put on, 30-minute anti-racist surgeries that I have every Monday for practitioners to come to me on an individual basis, have conversations about some of the things that are happening within their practice. You're going to catch me on TV. So as you said, I was invited on Channel 4 very recently on a daytime show called Steph's Packed Lunch to talk about World Book Day, the importance of representation, and why we need to make sure that these conversations are had with children under 5. So I think in terms of kind of a multi-pronged approach, I certainly want to make sure that is happening. But what I also don't want to do is become the only voice. So it's really important that we recognise I'm not the only Black person working in the early years sector. Lots and lots and lots of us. And sharing that load is really important. So with regards to that, I and a few other colleagues of mine, Laura Henry, Elaine, Jamal Colley Campbell, and Joss Cambridge Simmons, we created something called the Early Years Blacklist, where it becomes a directory of other Black practitioners, early years educators, teachers, people that specialise in SEND. We need to have a conversation about the intersection of race and SEND with children under 5. And we created a directory where people could go to who work in the sector if they're thinking about creating panels, having conversations, wanting article contributions. So, yeah, I mean, Alicia, I could go on. I don't want to. But I just want to kind of give you a flavour for the way in which the work that I am doing, only because of the legacy work of other people who have done before me, I'm able to do that now. And we have to talk about legacy, and people have allowed me to do this work. Because without those people, I wouldn't be here.
It's about having that space, isn't it? People have allowed us, people have spaces for us to now to be able to have these conversations and talk about it. One of the things that I know you're not from the health sector, which I'm from originally, but which blew my mind was that you're 4 times more likely to die in childbirth if you are a Black female, 3 times more likely from a mixed heritage background, and 2 times more likely from any other ethnic background. And what blew my mind the most about it is that everybody in that sector, if you're from health and social care sector, it's the biases that not just only people from, white British people, it's everybody in that sector. And it's about, because what we've been taught from a young age, and it's about how we look at ourselves in society, how we're treated. So it's really important because, anyone and everyone can have their biases, and especially people that are brown and Black from the community too can have biases towards other people, so it's just so important to have those conversations and talk about it further. So Liz, thank you so much. It's been amazing. We've probably definitely got some more questions for you, but we're going to go to fantastic Jeff now. Jeff, you're director of AOC for diversity. You've done some fantastic work, especially about getting people. I always say we get people to join the dance, don't we, Jeff? You've done some amazing work of getting some fantastic EDI leads across the country to work together. So why do you think it's so important for the work around Black history or around inclusivity? How is that really important for sort of AOC and sort of the FE sector?
For me, it's crucial. There's a couple of points. I really enjoyed listening to what Liz said, and I've got so many things to pick up on from what she was saying, because I can absolutely see the resonance there. And let's start for where you left off, Liz. To me, it's about the legacy. It's about creating the space for other people coming forward to go into that space and make that difference. At my age, I'm the son of someone who came here in the early 60s. So you're sort of this first generation going through. So we had some tough times, we had some good times, we had our challenges, we had our privileges. And things have changed, but they're not changing as fast as they could change. And I think it's about changing the way that we work. We're no longer single individuals working in a space. It's about creating momentum. It's about creating we call them game changers, creating and identifying the individuals who out there can change the game, who can change the narrative, connecting those people so that it was almost like a wave. They push the wave on, and then we get to a point where you normalize Black history, you normalize the idea of inclusion. You talked about representation there. Representation is great. At the moment, what people do is they count the number of Black faces they see on boards. What use is that? It's great for the black person on the board. I've been right to zoning boards, incredible. What's important for me is the quality of the representation, and it's the participation of those individuals. Now, we need to measure the quality of the representation, whether it's full engagement, whether that individual has full access, whether they can be their authentic selves at those meetings, whether they're empowered to participate, and whether they really feel as though they belong, and that power is shared at those meetings and in those environments. When that happens, I think we will get to a point of full inclusion. At the moment, we're counting visible differences in this, and that's fine as a starting point, but it's a long way from where we need to get to. The point you made there about assimilation, I think it's really quite crucial, because my generation, me to a certain extent, we assimilate. We belong, we strive to belong, but we lose our unique identity. And that's a great loss for organizations and for a country, because people from diverse backgrounds, we're all different. We bring a different thought. We bring different perspectives to the table. And if you lose your uniqueness, you use your unique self, you're not giving that different thought around that board table, around that conference table, around that business table, around that school, around that college, around that nursery. So it's really important for me that the legacy that we leave behind for people like yourselves is that you've got that confidence, you've got that strength, you've got that power to be your authentic selves around that table. And I think we're getting there. I don't believe that government can do it for us. I think it's around us as individuals and as a collective showing government how it could work, how it might work. And that's why I think the work that the ALC is doing, bringing together the practitioners, bringing together those game changers, because they're the ones who will give us the examples of practice. A bit like what you're doing there, Liz. You'll give us the curriculum, you'll give us the ideas that then can be put into policy. It's about policy following practice, not someone in a darkened room, which is normally a bunch of sort of middle-aged white men, creating a policy for us to follow. It's about us giving the examples and helping them to shape the policy from more examples. Absolutely agree with this idea of this deficit model. We talk about for me, have you seen, I'm not sure if you've seen Killing Eve, and there's a Chinese cleaner who goes around killing people and no one sees her because she's just a Chinese cleaner. How many people make eye contact with the black security guard as they walk into a shop? People don't. These people are missing. They're totally marginalized. We don't see them. And I think that's a huge risk for us here in the United Kingdom. These people have qualities, they have value, and we're not making the most of their value because we miss these people out. And that's your example there with the health service, Alicia. The health service is supported by people from minority ethnic backgrounds, and we gloss over them. How many people go into a hospital and look for a doctor, which is and you're looking for a doctor or a nurse, and it's normally a woman in a white coat or a white man as a consultant. We're missing these key individuals in organizations because we don't see them. And it's about getting that representation that is visible, it's authentic, and it's valued for what it does. And that's why Black history is really important. And you mentioned Wales. In Wales, the first woman to have a statue is a black woman, Betty Campbell. Because Betty Campbell, she gave me a good going over a couple of times. She was a teacher in the primary school. And even though as a grown adult, when Betty said something, you listened. And she had incredible authority. Now she's got a statue in Cardiff down to her. She's a black woman, she's a strong woman, and she's a role model for not just black people, but for white people. And I think that's something which is slightly different in Wales, where we think much more, holistically, I think, about things than might be the case in England. Why is it important to change the narrative? I think it's important to begin talking about this sense of belonging, and that's why history is so important. I love the way that in West Suffolk, the history that you did wasn't necessarily a national history. It wasn't talking about the impact of black people in Britain per se. It was the impact of black and minority ethnic people within West Suffolk, really localized, and the young people, all people, can see someone that they know or they've heard stories of this person. It's real. It's no longer something that you're reading in books. It's a real history. So then it becomes not just the history of that young black person, it becomes the history of the community. And it situates that person within the community and situates the black person you're talking about within the broader West Suffolk community. So it becomes our history. Sometimes we go for global examples. You think of a black leader, and Nelson Mandela comes to the fore. Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali. But how about the local people like Betty Campbell, who really have driven something, and who people in South Wales really know? So for me, the idea of inclusion is, yes, it's a big thing. It's about representation, but it's also about making it local, making it very personal. And something you mentioned there, I think, Liz, is without that inclusion being personal, without it making an impact on me as an individual in my environment, it's not going to work. It becomes a tick box exercise. It becomes something which we do because we have to. We might do it because it's morally the right thing to do. But when it gets personal, we will really drive it forward. And I saw a wonderful example in a college the other day, where we did this. I did this session on inclusion, and it was Wiltshire College, and I was really impressed by how many people came up afterwards and said, what can I do? And these are white people, and they were saying, well, what can I do? And because they were taking it personally, they had a personal agenda that they wanted to enact. So that to me was a quick win. It was a small win there, but it could lead to quite big things if each individual then takes up the mantle. So I think, Alicia, I'm not sure what your question was, but I was so enthused by what Liz was saying. I was picking up on the points that she was talking about. And the last point, I wanted to pick up was about change coming from youth. That we can put these things in place for others to come through and drive, but it's the young people who will help us to make the change. They're a different generation. They think differently, and if we can continue to sow the seeds around inclusion, around equity, around the acceptance that we're all diverse and nothing's you can't change that. We're just all different. So you have a choice that diversity and make the most of it, or you try and fight it. And I think young people are in that acceptance mode, and they want us to help them to make the most of the diversity that we have.
Completely agree. And like you said before, you both said and voiced it, having that. And I think as well, part of the Game Changer programme that AOC provided, which was so important for me to feel empowered as a woman as well, being empowered as a black woman, being able to go and feel like, I can go into spaces and I can talk and be able to have my voices heard. I think it's really important. And I think it's really important to start from, the age that Liz teaches as well, works with children. Because if you get that, can you imagine for all children from all diverse backgrounds to have that? Think about how much of a strong, amazing community we will have. And then from the ages we work with now in FE, the whole point of getting for Black History for us, it was, a student-led approach. I always say to young people who are 17, 18, if you could, go back in time, if we could be taught Black History all over again, what stories would you like to hear? A lot of people, 9 times out of 10, do they know about the Windrush generation? I always ask people when I start my staff training sessions, okay, were you ever taught Black History? And if you were taught Black History, what were you taught? Were you taught about ancient Kemet? Were you taught about, the untold heroes in the First and Second World War? Are you talk about, migrations? there's so many different elements to that, and if people knew how much things that we use, resources that come from Africa, which we use on a day-to-day basis here, it's just phenomenal. So it's about looking at that and using it within all of our history, really, because you can take it to every curriculum and pick it apart, and there's so much amazing information and knowledge to be told and to help empower everybody, really. So the whole purpose of making that history more local is because it's reachable. These stories are near you. That person could be somebody's grandmother, that could be somebody's, family member across the road. You could go to another part of the town and you'll be able to know and really be reachable part of those histories. So it's really lovely to have these conversations and make people feel inspired. We've got some open questions with you both, but before we do, I'm sure I know Piers has got some questions for you that he's itching to ask you, Jeff. But how do you feel like, more for in colleges, Jeff, or the FE sector, what can teachers start to do or the government? I always say it needs to start from the very top. My perception that it needs to come from the governors down, a downward approach, as well as upward approach, downwards and going up. So what can we do in sectors to start having these conversations, Jeff? What's the starting points or your golden tips, you would say?
It's a tricky one. The starting point. The starting point, I think, is that realization that we are diverse, and the starting point is that question. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to embrace it and celebrate it and make the most of it, or are we going to fight against it? And we have a choice. So to me, that is the starting point. That having that really tough conversation that people don't necessarily like having, because diversity can be seen as a euphemism. How many times have you heard people say, "Oh, he's so diverse"? You mean he's black? Just call it as it is. And we tiptoe around some of these things. The example I quote sometimes is how men find it difficult to talk about menopause. Let's not, because half the population will go through that. So let's begin to talk about some of these things, and let's put them out in the open. And once you begin having that, create that safe space, as they call it, for a conversation, then people begin to find the common ground. So I think it's beginning the conversation around almost demystifying this concept of diversity and race and ethnicity. We are different, and that's it. So then what do we do with it? And we have a choice. We accept, or we and celebrate, or we deny it. No one's going to deny it. So then what do we want to do with our staff? What do we want to do with students? And what do we want to do with the community? So that's how I tend to break things up into open up the argument, then identify the focus of our action, staff, students, or community. And then, for me, the important thing is, what's my personal action then at the end of this going to be? No, it could be just one single thing. And I'll take that action and follow that through. And what we tend to find, what I have found over the last couple of years, is that there are lots of people working in darkened corners, doing lots of good work. Liz, it's great to get to know you. And I'll be knocking on your door now, because I can see how you can be a benefit to the further education sector, just sowing some ideas, sowing some thoughts, and helping them to think differently. And the more we do that, begin to connect and share those things, the better it will be for us all. So my starting point will be demystifying things for both teachers and governors, identifying from the teachers what they want to do and who can support them. And people like yourself, Felicia, Liz, there's lots of them, you out there who can support. We make those connections. But the governors is really interesting, because for governors, I think it's very much about helping them to understand their responsibility. Because it could all fall on them at the end of the day. If things go horribly wrong, they're the ones who ultimately take the can. So that's the threat. But the positive part of it is that they have the potential to really make change with an organization. They have a potential to support the management in creating the resource, in arguing for the resources, in linking back to the community, in linking to government. So governors have a crucial role in this, because they have networks, they have connections, and ultimately they're the ones who I think can help drive it. So the message to governors is that your role is absolutely crucial. It's a positive role, and you'll get the credit for things going forward. but it's about what action you take and what connections you help your management make in providing for this diversity, in providing for the inclusion of the organisation.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. And one of the, like I said before, it's really important. I'll ask the audience the same question when they watch this. You know, were you ever taught Black history in school? You know, think about that. And if you did, what were you taught? So because a lot of people then feel uncomfortable talking about or teaching parts of the curriculum that they were never taught about themselves. So it's really important we have people like Liz, Piers, myself. There's so many amazing EDI leads that have done fantastic work in getting them to be involved in the story, and actually sometimes saying, you know what, put my hands up, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I would like to know, how can we start the conversations? And there's so many areas that we can do it around data, and there's massive areas, and it's just about looking at it and getting that support, and that's what we're doing today. Piers, have you got some questions for
Yeah, please.
Jeff?
I've been it's really been excellent to listen to you both, and I've been glancing at my list of pre-prepared questions, and so much of the questions that I had have been touched upon, but I wanted to kind of go off piece a little bit and ask a question based on something that Jeff said earlier, and refer it back to something that Liz mentioned. Jeff, I was quite struck by how you gave the example, for example, of the security guard, black security guard in Tesco, and numerous people who are deeply marginalised and, as you said, invisible to all intents and purposes in many ways. And I wanted to refer that back. Liz, you mentioned earlier about working with practitioners and the work that people, the internal work that people need to do. And going from Jeff's example as one example of how something really deeply racist can just exist like that, how, using that example, how then might practitioners begin to do some of that internal work? And how might they perhaps get help or advice on that? What should they do, really, as a direct question there, to begin that internal work?
Was that to me?
Oh, sorry, that was a question for Liz, please, Jeff. But
Well,
for both of you,
yeah.
really.
I think before I go on to that, Piers, one of the things that I wanted to say, just touching again on what Jeff had said, pertaining to legacy, it's really interesting you spoke about Betty Campbell and, of course, the significant work that she had done, but the work that I was doing and am continuing to do with Wales has been with Rachel Clark, her granddaughter. And so that linking there of coming together in terms of specialist work, lived experience, real nuanced understanding of the impact that's been had, and then being able to connect those dots as two black women. There's two black women who are leaders in education. And the beauty of that, I just really wanted to kind of let you know that, Jeff, that legacy work is still happening now. And actually that culmination of both mine and Rachel's expertise has been so beautiful to kind of see and to develop and grow. So I wanted to share that with you, and also that I've been to Wales.
Great.
I've stood next to the statue. I took a picture.
Love it.
But it's powerful. It impacts me as a black woman in Birmingham. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you.
My pleasure. Piers, so to your question, that work, the work, we've heard, Harry talk about doing the work, and now that he's married to Meghan, he spoke to Oprah about the work. Everybody who's doing anti-racism work wants to find out how best to do it without offending, without getting it wrong, without jumping in at the deep end. But there's also this hurriedness around it. Everybody wants to do it quickly. And what I always say is take your time. This is legacy work. You're not going to see the fruits of your labour in your lifetime. Guess what? We're still here having conversations that, the great Malcolm X was having. We're still having these conversations now. So knowing that this work has got to be things that we look at as longitudinal, really thinking about the fact that we're not going to get an award at the end of it. No ally cookies are going to be given because you're the white person that's doing that work. And the notion of allyship as well. What do we mean when we start to pick apart what it means to stand alongside? I don't want somebody to come and give me a voice. I've got a voice, okay? I don't necessarily even need you to amplify my voice. I have agency. And so when we're thinking about positionality and power, it's something we also need to understand. When we think about who we talk to, why is there a need to always have conversation? I say we are in the age of action. We've been having conversations. And when Jeff talked about this time, right, we need to be very urgent now because it's getting boring. I don't necessarily want to be talking about race all of the time, actually. I'm talking about race all of the time because racism is still here. I know that race is a construct, that it's social, it's being created so that power can continue to be upheld. But I understand the impact of racism means that I am in a position where I have to continue to talk about it. So when we're thinking about what practitioners can do, I think practitioners who are racialized as white in this context here get into the space of understanding what it means to be an active listener. When you're actively listening, there is so much more that you are absorbing as opposed to coming with the solutions that you think you have because you read a book once. Yes, there is some fantastic anti-racist literature out there. However, there is a history, a backlog of a diverse range of things that people can read and consume and sit with. Sit with that information. Think about what text you've consumed that has taught you about feminism. Are you looking at the work of Bell Hooks? Are you looking at the work of Angela Davis? Or is your feminism whitewashed? Have you thought about what you're thinking about when you're looking at curriculum? Have you looked at the work of Bernard Cord? Have we looked at what's been happening to Black children from before 1990? Have we then looked at the work of Professor Gus John? Have we understood how those two pieces of work, those bodies of work connect? Have we looked at the work of Stuart Hall? If we're thinking about sociology, if we're thinking about education, if we're thinking about lived experiences, if we're thinking about Black scholarship, are we doing that? Have we thought about the contribution of the East and Southeast Asian communities in the UK? Have we understood there is agency, there are voices there are contributions to education, or are we still concerned with Greek and Latin? And we're going to just be continuing to think about that forever and ever. And so when we're looking at, what can be done, there has to be a period of listening from practitioners who are racialized as white. There has to be a period of action that's collaborative. If we think about, the coalition, the Rainbow Coalition, the work of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther, thinking about the coalition of everybody coming together for that greater cause, which is, so we can say there is one race, the human race, and we're not saying that as a detractor from us amplifying the necessity to have conversation about Black Lives Mattering. We're not going to be part of the All Lives Matter crew. That's not the conversation that we're having. We're thinking about what it is that we're doing as a collective so that we can eventually get to that place where we are understanding equity. We can see equity. We've seen that there's been an urgency around the action, and we've done the action, and we continue to do the action instead of just having really nice, polite, kind conversations about what we're planning to do. We need to just do it now, the actual work that everybody's written about. So yeah, that's my response.
Thank you, Lisa. Excellent. Thank you.
And I think as well, from what you're saying about looking at the work and doing the work, and it's about thinking about the words and the terms we said about before, like unreachable, unprivileged. Those communities we say, reaching out, we go to communities and invite them to us because it's so important. They've got so much rich, important, diverse stories that we need to sit back and listen to as well and be active listeners, like you said. And just so much history behind it. So maybe sometimes taking a seat back and inviting those communities in to speak to us and do the work and talk about the stories, because you're going to get so much vast knowledge from that. So yeah, just what you're saying.
I was just going to say, Alicia, when I think about some of the language that even is just like common parlance in schools, talking about, I work in an inner city school, and what is that translated as? When we hear a white middle class teacher who's come through Teach First and has done a gap year in Ghana and helped to build a library, and then comes to work in an inner city school, what image are we conjuring? What are we saying about power and agency in those very words, that language? It is problematic.
We have to stop the labels. We have to change the narrative and to have a language that is a different language. I'm actually fed up. You think of the social structures that we've got of power that have been set up over history. Think of aid, for example. when we, as the global north, we give aid, it's through our gestures, great. And that giving of aid is still within the concept of what we're talking about here now. We're giving away our privilege. No, we're not. We are trying to create an environment where we can coexist, but actually where we can get the best out of each other, because we're all different. So when we talk about what we need to do, the first thing is that, again, is that tough conversation which says, I am aware of my prejudices, and we all have them, and let's just put these things on the table. That's not a problem. What the problem is, what do we do about it? How do we then try and base our decisions on evidence as opposed to our prejudgments? And that's the action. If that's the one action that we get sometimes, that someone goes away and says, you know what, I am now going to act based on the evidence I see, not on what I've been told 10 years ago, or I read it in a book. The other thing which is really important is understanding what our triggers are. What triggers me as an individual when I meet a black person, I meet a woman, or I meet someone who's gay. Is my status impacted? Am I confused? Is my relationships or is a sense of fairness? What triggers me as an individual? So there's a lot of introspection, I think, that needs to take place, and that's not a soft thing. If it's done in the right way, we get people to begin to change their mindsets and change how they think. I had a cracking story. I can't say where this happened, but Alicia knows where it happened. I was in a taxi with a taxi driver, and this guy began talking about Black Lives Matter and about a number of guys in Cardiff who had been falsely imprisoned, and he got really upset. A very big white guy, and I couldn't understand why this guy was so upset. And then he said, "Oh, I'm upset because I was in prison." So I said, "Well, why were you in prison?" He said, "Oh, I was in prison because I was in the National Front." And at that point, you begin to get a bit nervous in the taxi with this guy. But what he explained to me was that he joined the National Front because he did not feel included in his school. He's the same age as me. We're both in our 60s. He didn't feel included within his school. So he went down that particular road. It took him a while to really understand himself, to really understand his prejudices, to really understand why he was thinking the way he was. He thinks totally differently now. And no, he's an advocate, he's an ally, he's very anti-racist. But it took him a while. And now we need to start that process when that guy is in school. Not when he's 60 and not when he's in his 50s. It has to happen when he's in nursery, when he's 9, 10, and 11. So there's an urgency there now, because we can't have that thing continue over time. And the final point I think I'll make there, picking up on what you said there around equity, I think that's what education does really well. And the idea of a black curriculum and LGBTQ plus curriculum, a curriculum which sort of raised the profile of women scientists, I think that's really important that we have that, because it gives a holistic picture to young people of what the world is really like, not what a bunch of guys in a darkened room have decided that we're going to be taught. So that's why I think it's important that we have equity in this, because education is the starting point for this. And by having this inclusive curriculum, starting with race, yes, because that's something which is to the fore. But it's about women, it's about people who are gay, people who are transgender, it's about people who are neurodiverse. If we can have those representations within our curriculum, it gives the young people a bit more power, a bit more agency to, when they leave school, when they leave college, to take these things forward and act on our behalf. But that's from your point, Liz. From when you mentioned equity and action, it sparked that thought in my head.
Yeah, and Jeff, what you just said, I was literally having the same conversation before we came on the show with a colleague of mine, and it's just so important, because I always say, look, you've got to remember that if we are inclusive, how much better is that going to be for that student? If they haven't got to deal with X, Y, and Z, you know, you've got to think about from this perception. If you've got a young person that is dealing with, you know, unconscious biases all the time, how do you think it's going to make them feel when they go into the education sector, into the, you know, the world of, you know, higher education, further education, whatnot? Do you think they're going to be able to want to excel? Yes, they will probably, but how much better would it be for them as well if we have that inclusivity where we don't have to have these conversations on race and we just have that inclusive program, because everybody will benefit from that, and it's just, you know, and it's so important, like I said before. So I could talk to you guys for so long. Thank you so much. Thank you both so much, Liz and Jeff, for coming on, and I hope our audience that are watching it today have got something from this. I certainly have. I'm going to do some more research, especially.
Absolutely, same here. It's been really great listening to what you've been saying. Thank you.
And that's the whole purpose of being practitioners, you know, working in this sector. We're always learning, we're always having to reflect, we're always having to keep going on, and, you know, it's so important. So I'm going to end with this quote, which I absolutely love, and that is, education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world. So thank you. Up next, we have another inspiring practitioner coming on the show, Ashton Harewood, joining us from Suffolk One, and he'll be discussing his student-led approach in working with young people in the community on Black history. Hello and welcome back to our EDI TV series, Proud to Be. Today's session is about Black history. We have a fantastic guest joining us today in the studio, and that is Ashton Harewood. So thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Anisha.
You know, you do some fantastic work. So just tell us a little bit about your role and what you do.
So my main role, essentially, I'm a PPT. So I'm responsible, my sort of day-to-day job is looking after a cohort of students and sort of supporting any barriers to learning. So anything that could affect them doing as well as they possibly can do, I then sort of jump in and try and fix things and make their journey a bit smoother. And then obviously that help involves moving on with the rest of their life and all of that stuff. But how I've been brought into this world of work is another role I do on the side of that is on the race equality champion. So that was a new role that we had at One when myself and my colleague Ian, who unfortunately can't join us today, when myself and Ian took on the role, there was nothing in place previously. We had never even celebrated a Black History Month. So it was down to Ian and I to sort of put something in place that would help students and staff of different ethnic backgrounds feel more comfortable and supported.
How do you feel like that's progressed along? Because it's been such an amazing journey.
It's been a lot in such a short space of time. I think so. COVID obviously put a break on all of it, but what really kicked it off was the whole George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matters protests, and things just got massively boosted from that. And how it came about, students actually approached Dean and I and said, look, I've heard about what happened in America. I know that there are some issues that happen here. We don't ever have anyone to speak to about it. We don't know who to even speak to about it. So the students actually came to us and said they need something in place. And it literally just started off with Ian and I setting up a student group. We'd meet sort of every week, talk about any issues that mattered to them, any incidents, let's say, that they've been through. And what was really, really interesting is when the students would all sit around and share the type of things that they've been through and the experiences they've had, and just the casual comments that are just made to them, you start to see people pop up and realise, oh my God, it's happened to us as well. And I think that made people realise a bit more, actually, this is quite a common thing. And I remember after we started all of this, I sat down with my fiance and I was telling her about all of this stuff that we've done and we've spoken about. And even she couldn't believe the amount of racial comments and racial microaggressions that take place on a daily basis.
Do you think for young people, especially if you're from diverse backgrounds, that a lot of people have kind of been just told, you know, you just kind of get on with it and you just brush it down? So I always say that how much courage it takes a young person to come and tell you something's happened or this is taking place is so important. So to take it seriously and to show that support, to empower them, you know, is so important.
And it's also understanding as well, though. So students would speak to me, students of colour would speak to me, and they would explain the things that happened. And then when you look at the management and the people that they can speak to, they are all white people. So when I'm like, well, you can speak to them, the type of comments I've got back is I don't really want to. And when I ask why, I'm told that some of the things I'm told are like, well, not only will I have to explain why it's offensive, I'll have to explain why I'm offended by it. They may not realise it's a common everyday thing. It's not just a case of someone touching my hair. When it happens on a semi-daily basis, it becomes a little bit more than that.
So do you think as practitioners, as teachers, as staff working in the education sector, it's important actually to understand that journey? So
Absolutely
we don't,
right.
Sometimes it's important to have that space for young people where you don't have to explain. It's a site, can we understand?
Absolutely.
That's really important from all diverse
absolutely.
backgrounds to understand
Again,
that.
I mean, I've had students tell me that teachers have made comments to them like, you speak English really well, even though English is their first language. And just things like that. And you think, wow. And I actually had a student who done well in an English essay, and the teacher made a thing of it in the class, how well she done on her English essay, because English is a second language to her. I know. So it's and those type of things, I don't for a second think that the teacher actually had any ill thought behind that. But it's those simple things that you have to just stop and think, actually, is that okay?
And that's our biases that we've taken on with us from, you know, our early childhood. And we all have, we said before in a part of our series, is that we all have to have our own biases. But it's about reflecting on that and how does that make other people feel. And we said before, think about that with your mum or a family member of yours. How would that make you feel?
That's exactly right.
And you've got to put yourself in other people's shoes.
That's exactly right. So another thing Ian and I had done is we worked with HR and we have actually now made every single member of staff sit a training course in unconscious bias. Wow. So they at least have some understanding of what it actually is. And to be honest, I was quite worried about doing that because you know some of the reaction of some people, but it actually went really well. Everyone, almost everybody walked out of it and they learned something, they realised something they didn't realise previously.
And that could be our own judgments too, because possibly we've had bad experiences, you know, in education or other parts, you know, of the sectors, and we think, oh, this is not going to go well. And you can get the complete opposite.
You do. I mean,
you
find, I don't know about you, but when we try to do things in the past, you kind of get the feeling they're thinking, oh, it's the black group again. Oh, it's the black guys trying to sort something out again. But by making it more in your face, it's kind of made it more, or it's made it harder to ignore. So a perfect example again is, one of the first things Ian and I and the students done is we looked at the Suffolk 1 student prospectus and we looked through that and it was just white. There was just staff students, no diversity in this prospectus at all, and students had noticed it. And not only had students that we have in our centre noticed it, but they told us that their friends and family had noticed it too. So we've now completely redone the prospectus. There is diversity spread throughout it. Even the front cover, the main pictures, is gorgeous student we have just celebrating our diversity.
And how does that make you know, the students feel seeing that diversity?
Makes them feel a part of it, which they have told us. One thing that a student said that I will never forget is she said that she's never been to a school or college before and felt as part of it.
A belonging.
Exactly. She just felt like this mixed race kid that sits on the outside. Don't go with the black group. Don't go with the white group, and don't know where they fit. But because we've made our student group all ethnicities are welcome. All ethnicities are welcome. If you have a passion for EDI and for changing the culture, come along. And students haven't noticed it. The growth in our students that we work with has been amazing. They are now, so there's 3 of them. 3 students are pretty much single-handedly organising our Suffolk One Culture Day.
Wow.
So they're organising for different food samples,
Yes.
different stalls, henna tattoos,
Yeah.
all sorts of runway show.
Yeah, tell us about this culture day.
Okay,
like,
so we used to have a culture day at
Mm-hmm.
One where we would have, again, we'd have stalls set up. And historically, what it used to be is mainly staff actually would come in and they'd bring in some of
dressed
their
up and, yeah,
home
just-
cooking and get dressed up and stuff. But health and safety kind of put a knock on that in terms of bringing food in and stuff. And then when COVID hit. So we're relaunching it again, and it's going to be, we are including our LGBTQ plus. Thank you. We're working with those students as well, because it's important that they get involved as well. We're working with our supported learning students to try and celebrate disability as well. And the idea of the day is to celebrate culture. So students are going to be asked to come in their cultural clothes. So I've got a big Barbados flag that I'm going to come in wrapped around me. Haven't really thought of what else I'll be wearing, but I have a
you've
5
got the
foot by
colours,
4
yes.
Barbados flag.
Love it.
So I'll bring in that, and then we're going to have a runway show. So a runway going through the middle of the atrium where students can just walk along and show their cultural,
Sounds amazing.
their cultural belonging.
And I think that's so important. We were saying that belonging and having that sense of
belonging, yeah.
identity and feeling that they can come in how they want to dress up, and it's so important. Inclusivity on all the EDI areas.
Absolutely.
It's so important, and that's just really, it's a fantastic day. They get to try different food from different cultures.
Absolutely.
And traditional, authentic food as well. I think it's so important to have that as, it's
Well,
just,
we have a member of staff, Sharon, who is from Zimbabwe, I believe, and she makes the most amazing beans and rice, Zimbabwean beans and rice, and that's honestly, Alicia, if you're around on the 18th of March,
because I might have to hijack
pop
and
down,
bring
because Sharon
love food.
Mangoma's beans and rice are incredible.
See, and it's about
Incredible.
experience food, different cultures, and try.
Exactly.
I love trying different foods. So I'll be definitely.
It'll be great, and we've got the canteen to put on a cultural menu as well.
Wow.
So hopefully there won't just be pizza and chips.
And it's the elements of it. We don't have to just look at it from like a teaching element. You can look at it the whole part
Absolutely
of your,
right.
of your FE sector. Look at it from the foods, from the the clothing, getting everybody involved from the
I'll
from having
be honest
the
with
caretakers to everyone.
you, Alicia. I've found, and this is nothing against the teaching staff at all. They do an absolutely fantastic job. But I've actually found it easy getting everyone else involved, other than the actual curriculums.
So what barriers do you think we're having? Why?
The time. The time. So I was a teacher previously, so I do appreciate that there is a set curriculum that you have to get through in a set period of time. So the barriers that we have historically had is that there's just not enough time. We've got to get through this. We've got to get through 6 weeks of work in 2 weeks. Where do you want us to fit
X, Y, Z.
that?
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Some of them are. So I've sat down with A-level history, and we've written a whole truth about the empire, stuff that she'll deliver to all of our students throughout. So there is progress being done, but it's time. It is time as a teacher yourself. There is a certain amount of time, but it can be done. It's just a case of being a bit more creative with it.
And I think sometimes things take time, but if we want to get things done right, it will do, because we want to, like we said before, we want to create a legacy for people. We don't want to do a quick work, but it's the same time, making sure we let staff know this is what we want. This is the culture of what we want to put into place. We would like you to support us, because at the end of the day, it's about the students and students' voices being heard, and it matters, because we want all of our students to come away.
We want them to feel comfortable, don't we?
We do. We want them to have a sense of belonging. We want them to go away and go, I absolutely love being here, because I'm learning about so much more than just the, one part of the education
Exactly.
section. So,
and they're getting help further as well. So we'll talk to them about university and like sort of scholarship and grants that are available to diverse students to try and increase their participation. So we try and improve the whole student experience for them as well. We've got trips coming up. I think we have a trip in at the end of this month,
Yes,
we're going to
we do.
Kingston University because
Yeah.
they have almost 70% diverse students.
Wow.
Their student population is almost 70% diverse.
What does that mean then for our students? 'Cause I think it's important for students to go to different universities and see the diversity and what's on range as well.
Because you get now in the press over the last few years, I mean, I have heard, and I'll have students mention it to me as well. There's been quite a bit about black students in particular going to your top universities, your Oxford and your Cambridges and those. So after we do Kingston, so first of all, I'm jumping all over the place. So we wanted to show Kingston first because we wanted to show them a different experience. So coming from a student population where they are a very, very small minority of about 15%, going to an institution where they make up 70%.
Yeah.
And for them, I am hoping that will just increase a sense of confidence in them, knowing that there are places where they can fit in and just fit in perfectly fine and don't stand out. Then moving on from that, we want to then set up trips to Oxford and Cambridge as well to try and increase and to show them, look, you can go here.
We need to work with Stormzy soon, don't
Yeah,
we?
that's
Because
what I mean.
it's really important.
Because a lot of think
yeah.
you can't do this, but no, you
Exactly.
can do this. You
The
absolutely
sky,
can.
Sky is the limit. And I always think
Absolutely.
people need to know that these goals are reachable for everybody in our
Absolutely.
community. So it's so important. And hopefully I'm correct on this. You're also going to take a trip to Notting Hill as well.
We
Go
are.
on a-
Well, we were
go
hoping
on
to
a
include
journey.
that in the Kingston University walk, but there was a risk assessment.
Next
issue at
trip,
the
we'll
time.
do that, yes.
Next
No.
trip, so we're going to do a history tour of Notting Hill. So we've spoken to a company that runs it, and we're going to do a Black history tour of Notting Hill. Its foundations, where it started, how it came about, how it grew into what it is today.
I mean, the migration from it too.
Absolutely
it's
right.
just
Absolutely
phenomenal, amazing.
right.
From having, you got the carnival, Notting Hill Carnival,
Yeah.
from the different people in the community, and what is a day. So it's lovely to take a trip down memory
Absolutely.
lane for a lot of young people that don't know what the
When I
Windrush
was at
generation
school,
is, you know.
Alicia, so my grandfather was a part of the Windrush generation. I didn't learn about Windrush until I learned it off myself when I was in university, I think. There was nothing like this in schools. Schools did nothing. I'm not as dark as some of the other people I work with, but I was always made to feel like I'm not black, I'm not white, so where do you kind of fit? So for me, it's about making sure students understand they fit somewhere. They don't have to go into a particular box, and that's kind of the reason why I hate the term BAME as well, because it just puts everyone in this big box where I realise, no, you have your own diverse
You do.
identity.
And I always say the term BAME as well for people watching.
Yeah.
It's like I definitely don't call myself that. I'm sure
No,
you don't
I
class
don't at
yourself,
all.
and a lot of
Don't at
people
all.
from different diverse backgrounds don't. So it's about thinking about the language we use and how
Absolutely
it makes people feel when we say, for my example, me, the word coloured. I always say everybody's different. So my term, using the word coloured, for me, it's a big sort of, you can feel my heart jumping, because that's the term that my grandparents used to call, like, there was the no coloured, it was
Absolute.
that term, and I'm not a
At
racist,
least I'm
you know,
the same.
so-
The term coloured doesn't sit right with me
but
at
then,
all.
however, some people from communities will like it. So it's about talking and finding out what inclusive
It
language
is. I mean,
people
I learned recently that the term West Indies it could be offensive.
to some
offensive,
people,
but
yeah.
my granddad and
mean,
my
obviously,
father
yeah.
and my family. That's all I've ever known. That's all I've ever been told
Exactly.
to call it. So it is about understanding
yeah.
appropriate language and what is.
And what is inclusive language. And I always say, when people say, well, we don't know, because one person thinks this and another person thinks that, well, you know what, ask a person. It's
Ask
the
them.
same as with pronouns. I always put my
Absolutely.
pronouns are she and her. Well, actually, why do we do it? It's the same when we ask people. So just
Absolutely.
ask people, what are their preferences? As simple as that. And sometimes we have to get uncomfortable to get comfortable.
It's when you
In it,
get
but
kind of. It's when it gets the other way. So I've had people come up to me, and I'm all for ask me if you want to ask me, but it's sort of how you ask. So I've had someone come up to me. So what exactly are you?
A person.
I'm a male. I'm 33. Yeah. So I think it's about how
Having
you
those
ask and put it across.
conversations, yeah, no.
But our students have actually done a really good job with helping that. So I've just finished creating the equality and diversity tutorials to be delivered to all year 12 students. I asked the students for help with that. So I said, what areas of EDI is missed out before? And this is where all of this stuff come up, stuff that students wouldn't normally say is an issue. But since you're talking about it, Ashton, can you put that in as well? So we got things like hair discrimination, microaggressions, things that have never come up on a equality and diversity tutorial before, but then you think that it should.
Do you think we need to start tackling the elements of race before we can then start having inclusive sort of, you know, programs to society?
I think we do, but I think that it's, I don't want to sound negative about it, but it is, I kind of feel that is such a never-ending battle with a lot of people. There are some people's views and some people's understandings that you kind of won't change. And I think that will never change, no matter how much you put, how much you promote, how much you advertise. For some people, it just makes them turn against it, which was my worry with the unconscious bias training, that it might turn some staff and some people off. But I think it's important that we tackle it and we have awareness to it. A big issue is that a lot of people who are supporters of a cause, even themselves, do not realise the extent of it.
And I think as well, we need to, one, get the awareness, look at our own unconscious biases, but also what's the next steps? Because there's no point in having that information, you're not going to action that. It's really important to look at what are the next steps, how do we work with our students? Is it a student-led approach? Are we looking at data? Are we doing fantastic work like you and Ian are at Suffolk One and starting to get them involved where now they're doing trips and whatnot, where they're now leading it, you know?
Exactly.
So it's about giving them a voice and then they can lead and be amazing, diverse young people in all different sectors, and that is just amazing. So I'm so glad you've been able to come and tell your story for professional development for staff to see, and hopefully, I mean, I'm sure have, and I'm definitely going to go and do this Notting Hill tour myself.
Absolutely, you'll be invited along,
Yes,
Alicia. Of course you will.
But thank you so much, Ashton.
Been a
for
pleasure as
joining
always.
us, and you know, pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been a fantastic show. I hope that you've all been able to take something on. This is our final series on EDI, and we started with Black History, so we're going to finish with Black History, and I think it's really important. That's how we sort of, got this sort of conversation going in EDI, so it's so important. So thank you all for joining us.